The private negotiation suite on the 62nd floor felt like a suspended world. Quiet, carpeted, suffocatingly elegant. A pane of smoked glass revealed only the blurred glow of Dubai's skyline, turning the room into a kind of chamber where sound died and decisions worth hundreds of millions were made without echo. At the center of the room, a single obsidian table. At the head of it, Sheikh Marwan al-Hazim, pen in hand, signature page already turned toward him. A 240 meters acquisition waiting for the final stroke. And at the margin of that same table, barely acknowledged, stood her, Lina Saelm, contract linguist, invisible by design. She kept her gaze low, her hands folded, her badge facing inward so no one would remember her name. The men around the table dismissed her with the polite irrelevance reserved for staff who were necessary but unimportant. Then the Sheikh's advisor placed a leather folio before her. "Translate this," the billionaire said suddenly, his voice in a clipped Gulf dialect that carried the soft mockery of someone who expected failure. "If you can." The room stilled. Executives smirked. Someone exhaled a quiet laugh. Lina felt the old heat rise in her. The childhood humiliation of being spoken over, the academic collapse that had cost her everything. The fear of being noticed only when someone needed an easy target. She opened the folio. Her eyes touched the text. Ancient phrasing, obscure legal syntax, a very specific regional pattern, deliberate, theatrical, almost a trap set for anyone who only pretended to understand. She lifted her chin, and in flawless, resonant classical Arabic, a register none of them expected, a form older and purer than the dialect they used to mock her. She delivered the translation line by line, her voice steady, precise, impossible to belittle. Silence fell. The billionaire's smirk dissolved. In that suspended moment, something shifted. Not in the room, but in him. He stared at her walking away, unable to understand how he had missed someone like her. The suite recovered slowly from the shock, as if the soundproof walls had absorbed more than voices. Lina stood near the far end of the table now, pretending to leaf through documents, though her fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the attention suddenly forced onto her. She hated attention. It always came with consequences. Sheikh Marwan's advisors exchanged uneasy glances. One of them cleared his throat, attempting to restore the hierarchy that her flawless, classical Arabic had just shattered. "It was simply a test," he said, "a formality." But Lina had heard the tone earlier, the slight tilt of condescension, the casual amusement in the Sheikh's clipped dialect when he had said, "If you can." The humiliation had been intentional, almost ritualistic. Men like these often opened negotiations with dominance displays, especially toward people they assumed they would never see again. Now the billionaire leaned back in his leather chair, studying her with a new, unsettling scrutiny. The pen he had been moments away from using to authorize the 240-meter transfer rested idle between his fingers. "What else do you do besides translate?" he asked. Still in that same dialect, but softer now, less cutting. "I analyze," she answered without lifting her eyes. "Sometimes texts, sometimes people." A faint, fractional smile appeared at one corner of his mouth. Not kind, not threatening, simply curious. It made her skin tighten. Powerful men only became curious about invisible women for two reasons: usefulness or danger. She didn't want to be either. The lead negotiator stepped forward, eager to move the meeting along. "Sheikh Marwan, with your permission, we should proceed. The sellers team is waiting for confirmation." The billionaire nodded, but his gaze didn't leave Lina. She hated that look, the one that meant she was suddenly interesting, which always led to being needed, which almost always led to being trapped. Lena felt the familiar urge to retreat, to blend back into the edges of the room. She gathered her notes and tried to slip toward the service corridor, where she belonged. But as she moved, the billionaire's voice cut through the cold air. Stay. One word. Soft. Commanding. Her stomach tightened sharply. She paused, turning only slightly, enough to show obedience without surrender. The suite's lighting carved her silhouette against the smoked glass. A woman who wanted nothing except to disappear. Since you already reviewed the folio, the sheikh continued, you may as well remain for the presentation. Consider it educational. The advisors chuckled again, relieved to have found a new angle for amusement. They thought she would shrink. They thought she would blush or fumble or apologize. Instead, she nodded once and returned to her spot at the margin of the table, expression unreadable. Inside, though, a quiet dread opened its wings. Staying meant exposure. Exposure meant risk. Risk meant the past creeping back in ways she could not afford. But she remained standing. Sometimes the smallest act of resistance is simply not moving. And in every room where power gathers, silence can be the sharpest blade. Lena stood perfectly still, the documents pressed lightly against her chest as the team prepared the next phase of the presentation. A faint hum from the recessed lighting filled the space. The kind of sound one only noticed when one lived quietly, habitually, on the edge of rooms. She had spent years perfecting this invisibility. It was safer that way. Her life outside this suite was a careful arrangement of small, controlled routines. A shared apartment with flickering blue lights in the hallway, overdue rent notices folded discreetly under her door, and the constant balancing of translation gigs that paid too little but required less exposure than academia ever had. She still carried the weight of that failure. The collapsed doctoral program, the humiliating hearing where professors spoke around her, not to her, as if she were a case study and not a person. The debt from those years still clung to her like a second skin. Every new job she accepted felt like another desperate attempt to outrun the gravity of it. Her work today was supposed to be simple. Translate a few contract sections, leave quietly, invoice, survive another month. But now she was trapped in a negotiation suite with a man whose signature could move hundreds of millions, and whose attention she had accidentally captured. She watched him from the corner of her vision. Sheikh Marwan sat perfectly still, shoulders squared, every gesture deliberate. He belonged to the category of men who were groomed for power since childhood, men who rarely apologized, men who didn't understand the concept of consequences applying equally to themselves, men like that could reshape a life casually, intentionally or unintentionally. And she could not afford to have her life reshaped again. One of the analysts dimmed the lights slightly to begin the projection. The marble table reflected the soft glow as a massive contract document appeared on the main screen. Page 346, subsection 7.4. A section dealing with provenance, historical custody, and ownership lineage, her specialty. Her pulse quickened, but she forced her expression to remain calm. She reminded herself that she was only here to witness, not intervene. Yet her eyes traced the lines instinctively, the way a musician's fingers twitch when hearing familiar chords. Something about the syntax felt unusual, not wrong, just slightly off, like a violin string tuned a fraction too tight. She tried to look away. This wasn't her business, not her responsibility, not her risk to take. But old habits, the academic training, the forensic instinct she had buried after her collapse, stirred painfully awake. A quiet voice inside her whispered the one thing she feared most. If something goes wrong here, they will blame you just for being in the room. She held her breath, steadying herself. She needed this job to end cleanly. She needed to leave unnoticed. She needed this world of marble tables and 240 Mayhauser decisions to forget she ever existed. But as the screen flickered, illuminating the worried lines beginning to form between her brows, she realized something she had always known. Invisibility protects you. Until the moment it doesn't. The projection shifted again, enlarging a long column of clauses written in dense legal Arabic. The room darkened further, leaving only the bluish light from the screen and the dim gold line of the city bleeding through the smoked glass behind them. Lena wished she could slip into that darkness entirely, but she had been ordered to stay. A server entered quietly with a tray of cardamom coffee and small glass cups. He served the sheikh first, then the advisors, then the negotiators from the seller's side. When he reached her, he hesitated, not out of courtesy, but because he wasn't sure whether someone like her was meant to be served at all. She gave a small shake of her head to spare him the decision. Invisibility was easier when she helped maintain it. Sheikh Marwan noticed. His voice cut across the table, low but unmistakable. "Server!" The server obeyed instantly, placing a cup before her with both hands. The gesture drew attention she didn't want. Eyes lingered. Someone smirked. Someone else raised a brow. Power had spoken. And now she mattered, even if only symbolically. Attention, in this room, was less like light and more like a scalpel. The lead presenter resumed. "Our verification team has confirmed that all historical custody records match the seller's claims. The signature lineage is unbroken, the seals intact, and the vellum consistent with the 13th century corpus." Marwan nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. The seller's representatives relaxed visibly. One even leaned back in his chair with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. It was the look of someone who believed the finish line was already crossed. But Lena's eyes kept tracing the projected lines of text. The syntax still bothered her. Not enough to raise suspicion, only enough to make her stomach twist with a faint, familiar unease. She tried to ground herself. She cupped the warm coffee between her palms. She listened to the presenter's cadence. She focused on the neutral sound of legal language echoing in the room. "This acquisition," the presenter continued, "positions the sheikh as the sole custodian of the manuscript collection, pending the signing of Addendum B." Addendum B appeared on the screen, and that was the moment her pulse stumbled. The phrasing, the order of clauses, the unusual placement of a passive verb that had no historical precedent in documents of this type. Her breath caught. No one else reacted. Not the advisors. Not the sheikh. Not the sellers who waited with barely disguised triumph. Lena lowered her gaze, forcing herself to stare only at her cup. She repeated silently, "Not my problem, not my business, not my risk." But the words didn't settle. They only rattled like coins dropped into a well with no water at the bottom. Her eyes lifted again despite her will. Because sometimes you don't choose to be a witness. You are forced into it. And there is no safe way to unsee what you have already seen. The lights brightened just enough for the next team to enter. 3 specialists flown in from different institutions, each carrying an air of polished certainty. Their suits were immaculate, their confidence rehearsed, their greetings aimed exclusively at the men who mattered. None of them acknowledged Lena. That was normal, expected, almost comforting. One of the experts, a conservator with silver-framed glasses, began arranging high-resolution images on the secondary screen. He spoke with the assertiveness of someone who had never been challenged. As you can see, the ink patterns align perfectly with known 13th century mixtures. Iron gall with trace copper, consistent, stable, exactly what we expected. Another expert, a provenance analyst, stepped forward and tapped a document. "Our analysis confirms the seals as original. No modern embossing, no synthetic residue. Every element supports authenticity." The sellers nodded with a rehearsed calm. They had expected this. They needed this. The Sheikh's advisors exchanged smug glances. The acquisition team was already discussing how the media announcement would be structured. Everything was perfect, immaculate, undeniable. Except it wasn't. Not to her. Lena kept her eyes lowered, but every word clawed at the quiet alarm forming in her chest. She'd seen this pattern before, in academia, in failed committees, in rooms where authorities substituted evidence with confidence. When too many people declared perfection too quickly, it often meant they needed everyone else to stop looking. The conservator zoomed into a magnified section of the manuscript, a flourish of calligraphy near the margin. "You can observe," he continued, "the natural cracking in the ink, characteristic of centuries-old oxidation." Everyone leaned forward, everyone except her, because in that magnification she saw something none of them mentioned. The cracking was inconsistent, too symmetrical. The lines looked natural from a distance but revealed a subtle digital regularity under high zoom, like someone had replicated the degradation of iron gall ink using pattern templates instead of real aging. Her throat tightened. She reminded herself again, "You are not here to intervene. You cannot afford another academic disaster." But the weight of the room pressed against her ribs. The Sheikh glanced briefly in her direction, not a long look, just enough to signal he remembered she was there. She wished he hadn't. The provenance expert concluded triumphantly. "In short, Your Excellency, this manuscript is flawless. A masterpiece. A crown jewel." A ripple of agreement passed around the table. Pens were straightened, pages adjusted. The energy shifted into one of comfortable inevitability. But Lena felt the air differently. Thin, fragile, like the moment before glass breaks. She told herself to breathe, to stay silent, to survive this job. Yet the unease inside her kept sharpening, becoming something she could no longer dismiss as imagination. Because the most dangerous lies are the ones wrapped in perfect confidence. The advisors dimmed the lights again as the final verification phase began. A soft mechanical click echoed through the suite as a portable spectral analyzer was placed on the table, a device she had seen only twice in her life, both times during her brief and painful years in academia. The sellers watched with barely concealed victory. The Sheikh's team watched with growing satisfaction. Lena watched because she couldn't not. The lead analyst activated the device. A beam of cold light scanned across the projected manuscript folio, producing a series of color-coded bands that scrolled across the secondary screen. Spectral readings confirmed the vellum fibers match 13th century sheep parchment. The analyst announced, "Protein degradation is exactly within expected parameters. The manuscript is unquestionably authentic." A murmur of approval drifted across the table. Another expert took over. The handwriting analysis supports a single historical scribe. No modern interpolation, no inserted folios, no synthetic treatments. The room warmed with collective relief. The comfortable, heavy warmth of men who believed they had won. Lena felt none of it. Her gaze remained fixed on a tiny pattern near the bottom margin of the displayed page. A curvature in one stroke. Not wrong, but not lived in. Not fatigued by time. A pen stroke made by someone who had studied old forms perfectly, but had not felt them. She blinked hard. Maybe she was seeing ghosts. Maybe her mind was playing academic tricks again. The same instincts that had once consumed her and led her straight into ruin. The Sheikh leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "It seems," he said in a low, measured tone, "that I am purchasing history." His advisors nodded readily, too readily, as if echoing him ensured their place in his orbit. One even whispered something about cultural immortality, earning a faint smile from the sellers. But the unease inside Lena tightened like a fist. Then the worst moment came. "Bring up Addendum B," the sheikh instructed. The addendum appeared again, the one she had glimpsed earlier. The one whose syntax scratched at the back of her mind like an unanswered question. The legal advisor stepped forward. "This clause is standard in acquisitions of heritage assets, merely formalizing the transfer of custodial rights." Lena's breath stuttered. Standard? It wasn't. Not with that phrasing. Not in that order. Not with that deliberately archaic verb placement. But she forced herself to remain still. One of the sellers leaned toward the sheikh with a polished smile. "If Your Excellency approves, we can proceed to signature." The room brightened slightly as pens were handed around. A subtle electricity filled the air, the tension of something huge about to happen. Lena pressed her nails into her palm. Her heartbeat throbbed unevenly. Her throat felt tight. Someone placed the signature folder near the sheikh. The billionaire uncapped his pen. The advisors straightened. The sellers inhaled. The room braced. And Lena, who had spent her entire life staying silent, felt the first undeniable pull toward a truth she did not want to speak. Because sometimes discomfort isn't fear. Sometimes it's the first warning that the world is about to tilt. The sheikh held the pen with the quiet assurance of someone accustomed to altering destinies with a few strokes of ink. His advisors leaned in, forming a kind of human shield around him, eager to usher the acquisition into existence. The sellers mirrored their posture, their confidence hardening into something almost predatory beneath the surface charm. Lena felt the air thicken, not metaphorically, physically, as if someone had lowered the oxygen in the suite. Her back pressed lightly against the leather-upholstered wall panel. She wished she could melt into it and vanish. Her pulse fluttered with that familiar, unwelcome pairing, dread and recognition. The same sensation she had felt the day her doctoral committee dismantled her research with smiles sharp enough to draw blood. The same sensation that had pushed her out of academia and into these silent, marginal roles where she tried very hard not to be seen. But the contract on the screen wouldn't let her hide. Addendum B glowed in front of her like a wound. Every clause felt too strategically placed. Every phrase carried a weight she couldn't ignore. Her eyes darted toward the provenance analyst who had earlier spoken so confidently. He seemed proud of the clause, as if it reinforced his earlier conclusions. But she saw the flicker. So brief most would miss it. Of his eyes avoiding the final two sentences. Avoidance is louder than any alarm bell. The sheikh tapped the table once, a soft, rhythmic sound. "Shall we begin?" Pens clicked open around the room. The lead advisor placed the signature page directly before him. "Your Excellency, once this is signed, custodial ownership transfers immediately, a masterpiece joining your private collection." The sellers nodded. One of them tightened his cufflinks, a gesture of pre-celebration. Lena's stomach coiled. Her instincts whispered urgently, "Look again." So she did. Her eyes traced the screen with forensic calm, a skill she had sworn never to use again. The archaic passive verb, the restructured syntax, the placement of the custodial responsibility clause where it should never appear, the subtle shift in legal burden hidden behind historical phrasing. Everything about it was wrong. But speaking meant exposure. Exposure meant risk. Risk meant her life, already fragile, could collapse again. She forced herself to swallow, but her throat resisted. The sheikh lowered his pen toward the page. Her breath broke, not loudly, just enough that she heard it. And he didn't. The pen hovered. The sellers leaned forward slightly, unable to hide their anticipation. The advisors prepared their practiced smiles. Lena gripped the dossier in her hands until the edges cut into her skin. This was the moment she always avoided. the one where truth demanded a voice. And voices like hers were never welcomed in rooms like this. But some truths refuse silence, and sometimes the smallest hesitation before a signature contains the entire future. The pen touched the page. A soft click, ink, meeting paper, echoed far louder in Lena's mind than in the suite. Her breath lodged painfully under her ribs. She didn't move, but something inside her leaned forward, searching for a path out of the suffocating silence. On the screen, Addendum B expanded again, magnified to fill the wall. And then she saw it, not the syntax this time, not the archaic verb, something smaller, almost invisible, a microscopic alignment issue. To anyone else, it looked like nothing, the smallest irregular spacing between two characters in the historical script. A spacing that should never, ever appear in a 13th century manuscript produced by hand on prepared vellum. Uneven spacing is normal in handwriting, but this spacing was wrong in the opposite direction. It was too perfect on one side, too mathematically consistent on the other, as if someone had digitally replicated organic inconsistency and accidentally left a trace of the template grid behind. A ghost of a pattern. A technical fingerprint of forgery. Her pulse hammered, her fingertips tingled, her vision sharpened into unnatural clarity. The old academic instinct coming alive like a creature she had buried but never killed. She blinked, forcing herself to confirm it again. There it was, a faint, fractional misalignment where the ink cracking overlapped perfectly with the curvature below it. Real ink spreads unpredictably on vellum. It never forms repeated curves. Never. Her stomach dropped. She realized suddenly, sickeningly, that the expert's presentation was built to overwhelm, to bombard the sheikh with so much confidence that the anomalies disappeared under noise. She glanced around the table. No one else had seen it. No one else wanted to see it. Most dangerous of all, the sellers were too calm, too prepared. Their stillness had the shape of people waiting to watch a trap spring shut. Her gaze snapped back to the addendum. If she was right, and she knew she was, then this wasn't merely a forged artifact. It was a legal ambush, a 240 meters trap disguised as history. The sheikh lifted the pen again, preparing for the next stroke. The advisors leaned closer, relieved that the most tedious phase was finally ending. Her throat tightened so violently she almost coughed. She took one step forward before she even realized she had moved. A small sound escaped her. A whisper, nothing more. No one heard it. The billionaire shifted in his chair, adjusting the angle of the page. She tried again, louder this time. Still too soft. Fear strangled her voice. Fear of humiliation. Fear of being wrong. Fear of losing the little she had left. But beneath the fear was something else. Something older. Something she had forgotten she possessed. A refusal to let a lie this elaborate pass unchallenged. The sheikh lowered the pen toward the final line, and Lena felt something inside her snap into clarity. Truth is silent until the moment it demands a voice. The pen hovered over the final signature line, a thin, gleaming moment suspended between wealth and catastrophe. The sellers leaned forward almost imperceptibly, like men preparing to inhale victory. The sheikh's advisors straightened with quiet satisfaction, rehearsed smiles flickering at the edges of their mouths. Lena felt her heartbeat stutter. Her palms were damp. Her throat burned. Her pulse thudded in her ears like an approaching storm. She took another step toward the table. No one noticed. Why would they? She wasn't part of the geometry of the room. Not the triangle of power formed by the sheikh, the advisors, and the sellers. She was furniture, background, a necessary ghost. But ghosts sometimes speak. Her voice broke free before she could stop it. Your Excellency. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. The pen froze, every head turned, the slow, harsh swivel of men, unused to being interrupted, least of all by someone who should have remained silent. Heat rushed to Lena's cheeks. Her hands trembled as she clutched the dossier to her chest. She forced herself not to shrink backward, though every instinct screamed to retreat. The lead advisor scowled. This is not the moment. One of the seller's representatives let out a soft, disdainful laugh. She misunderstands the process. Continue, Your Excellency. The sheikh didn't continue. He watched her. Not angrily, not kindly, just intently, as if trying to understand why someone like her would break the unspoken laws of the room. Lena swallowed hard. Her voice felt like glass in her throat. "There is an issue," she said. "In Addendum B." The temperature of the suite changed instantly. The advisors stiffened. The sellers went perfectly still. The experts exchanged looks of irritation mixed with fragile, rising anxiety. The lead advisor stepped forward, voice clipped. "You are not qualified to assess the legal—" "She is a linguist," the sheikh interrupted quietly, his gaze never leaving her. "Let her speak." Those 3 words shifted the entire gravitational field of the room. Suddenly she was no longer invisible. Suddenly her mistake, if it was a mistake, could cost her everything. Her hands shook harder. She hid them behind the dossier. She forced herself to breathe once, deeply, anchoring her courage to a memory she rarely touched. Her father placing old manuscripts in her hands, telling her that language could save or destroy empires. She stepped closer to the screen. "There is a structural anomaly," she said softly, "a pattern that should not exist in any document from this period." The sellers erupted instantly. "This is absurd. She's overstepping. She's not an authentication expert." But Lena didn't look at them. She looked at the sheikh, the only person who mattered now. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in concentration. "Show me," he said. Her pulse throbbed so violently she thought she might faint. She moved toward the projector controls, her fingers trembling, her voice barely steady. Behind her, the room bristled. The first ripples of panic, the first fractures in a scheme that had relied on silence. Because once truth enters a room, even quietly, nothing stays comfortable. Sometimes the smallest voice is the only one that can stop a disaster. The room was too quiet as Lena stepped toward the projector console. The kind of silence that feels like a blade. Her hands trembled, but her movements stayed precise. She had spent years learning how to hide panic under practiced stillness. The sheikh leaned back in his chair, watching her with an expression that had lost all traces of amusement. Now he looked like a man evaluating the possibility that the ground beneath him wasn't stone but ice. "Enlarge the margin," he instructed. His voice was calm, too calm. The sellers' faces blanched. Lena adjusted the projection, zooming in until the calligraphy filled the wall. Every stroke was magnified into towering lines of ink. The experts shifted uneasily. They preferred distance. Distance made flaws disappear. She tapped the corner of the screen with her finger. There! It was barely visible. A hairline irregularity in the spacing between 2 characters. Minuscule, delicate, but wrong in a way that only someone with her training would recognize. One of the experts scoffed. "Microscopic inconsistencies are common in aged vellum." "No," she said, her voice firmer now. "Not this kind." Her confidence surprised even her, but once she began, the words flowed with terrifying clarity. The clarity of someone who had once lived in this world before being exiled from it. "This isn't an organic inconsistency. It's a replication error, the curvature of this ink crack," she pointed again. repeats with mathematical precision. Nature doesn't repeat imperfections. The sheikh leaned forward slightly. She switched slides, pulling up the spectral scan the experts had presented earlier. You see here, the protein degradation curve. She traced the line. This pattern is identical to a vellum sample authenticated last year. Identical, down to the micro-oscillation. She paused. That should be impossible. Every vellum sheet ages uniquely. For two documents to share an identical degradation signature, someone would have needed to copy an existing spectral profile. A cold ripple passed through the room. The lead seller stepped forward. This is technical speculation. She's misinterpreting, but Lena was already pulling up the handwriting overlay. This scribe's hand supposedly comes from the 13th century, she continued, but the angle of the terminal stroke here matches a modern imitation style taught in restoration workshops, a style created only 12 years ago. A murmur of shock escaped one of the sheikh's advisors. Lena delivered the final blow. This manuscript wasn't preserved. She inhaled. It was manufactured. The sellers erupted instantly, voices clashing over one another, outrage rising like heat off stone. Defamation! She isn't an expert. This is sabotage. The sheikh raised one hand, and the room froze. He didn't look at them. He looked only at her. Is what you're saying, he asked slowly, that if I sign this document, I will be buying a forgery? She shook her head. Worse, she said softly. You would be agreeing to a custodial clause designed to make you legally responsible for the crime. The addendum shifts liability to the buyer. She let that sink in. It means that once you sign, the forgery becomes your fault, even though you're the victim. The sheikh's face darkened with something cold and lethal. Across the table, the sellers finally looked afraid. Truth, when spoken clearly, has a way of unraveling even the most elaborate lies. The air in the suite changed, not gradually, but with a sudden, almost metallic shift. As if the truth Lena had just spoken altered the chemistry of the room. The sellers stiffened first, then the experts, then the advisors. Only the sheikh remained perfectly still, his face carved into a calm that was far more dangerous than any raised voice. Explain, he said quietly. Lena swallowed, feeling every pair of eyes burn into her. She had stepped beyond the boundary of her role, beyond safety, beyond anything she could undo. But the trap in Addendum B was too precise, too malicious, too engineered to stay unspoken. She pointed to the lower half of the projected clause. These lines here, they aren't historical, they're legal, modern legal phrasing disguised under archaic structure. The lead advisor frowned. What exactly does it do? She zoomed in again, her finger tracing the offending lines. It reverses custodial responsibility, she said. Simple words, terrifying consequences. In plain language, she continued, the moment you sign, you don't just acquire the manuscript. You inherit the liability for any irregularity in its provenance, including fraud. The sheikh's jaw tightened by a fraction. She pressed on. This phrase here, the one framed like a poetic flourish, it's actually a clause that shifts the burden of proof to you, meaning that if anyone challenges the authenticity later, her voice dropped. You lose even if you win. A sharp inhale from one of the advisors broke the silence. The sellers tried to interrupt. This is absurd! No court would... But Lena raised her voice for the first time, cutting clean through theirs. A court won't matter, because the clause also requires the custodian, you, to privately compensate any future claimant, quietly, outside judicial review. The sheikh's gaze sharpened, now entirely predatory. Lena continued, her voice steadying as the forensic logic solidified. And the most important part, This addendum wasn't attached to the original manuscript dossier. It was inserted into the acquisition packet later. The syntax is different. The aging pattern is mismatched. The metadata of the scan shows a different timestamp. She highlighted the digital signature on the bottom corner of the document. Look, this seal is genuine, but the compression artifact around it isn't. Someone lifted it from a real document and layered it onto this fake addendum. One of the experts turned pale. The seller's composure cracked into raw panic. The sheikh leaned back slowly, eyes half-lidded, in a way that suggested he was recalculating the entire landscape of the room. So, he murmured, this was not a sale. Lena met his gaze, terrified but resolute. It was a transfer of guilt. Silence, heavy, absolute. Then the sheikh spoke, each word measured like a blade. And they expected me, he said, to pay $240 million to become the owner of their crime. A single truth settled over everyone present. Some traps are not meant to steal your money. They're meant to steal your future. For a long moment, no one spoke. The suite felt colder than before, as if the skyscraper itself had withdrawn its warmth, leaving only tension suspended in the air. The sheikh rested both hands on the table, not clenched, not shaking, just still, like a man deciding whether to end the conversation or end the people in it. The sellers exchanged panicked, wordless glances. Their confidence, so polished minutes ago, now cracked at the edges. One of them tried to recover. "Your Excellency, this is a misunderstanding. The addendum is standard protocol." The sheikh's advisor snapped. "Then why disguise it with archaic phrasing?" The sellers froze. Another advisor chimed in, pointing at the screen. "And why embed a custodial liability clause inside a historical replica? No legitimate institution does that." The sellers had no answer. Lena stood still, her breathing shallow. She felt both hyper-visible and strangely distant, as if she were watching the room from behind a pane of glass. She had detonated something. She knew that now. And the shockwave was only beginning. The sheikh rose slowly from his chair. "Show me," he said to Lena, "the part where the custody obligation becomes secret." She zoomed in again, her fingers steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Here. This phrase uses archaic structure to conceal a modern requirement for private settlement. And this term, it appears in no manuscript before the 20th century. Someone engineered this text to look ancient while functioning like a contract." The sheikh nodded once, a single heavy acknowledgement. "What happens," he asked, "if I had signed this without noticing?" "You would become the legal custodian of a forged asset," she answered, "and the sellers could claim ignorance. Any investigation would start with you." "Meaning?" "You take the fall," she whispered. "Completely." A low, stunned murmur spread across the advisor's ranks. The seller's lead negotiator broke. "This is being blown out of proportion." "No," the sheikh cut in, voice soft but lethal. "It is being exposed." He walked toward the screen, studying the text with narrowed eyes. Not the eyes of a man betrayed. The eyes of a man counting the consequences. "The provenance," he said slowly. "The spectral analysis. The seals. All rehearsed." The experts shifted uncomfortably. One of them wiped sweat from his forehead. "You were paid," the sheikh murmured, "either to lie or to not look too closely." The silence that followed was a confession without words. Lena's heart pounded. She stepped back instinctively, wanting distance, wanting shadow. But the billionaire turned toward her, not with gratitude, not with anger, but with something far more unnerving: recognition. "You saw what 12 men trained to deceive, hoped no one would ever notice." Lena lowered her eyes. "I didn't plan to." You weren't meant to. His tone shifted, deeper, cooler. And that is why you saw it. The sellers began to whisper among themselves, frantic now, calculating escape routes, damage control, lies to deploy. But the sheikh raised a hand. The whispers died instantly, because once a lie is revealed, panic cannot save its architects. And the architects were finally realizing the structure they built was collapsing under its own precision. The suite no longer felt like a negotiation room. It felt like a pressure chamber. Every person inside it understood that the equilibrium had shattered, and that the quiet man standing at the head of the table now held absolute control. The sheikh turned his back on the sellers, studying the magnified text on the screen with a composure that bordered on terrifying. The calm before a storm that knew exactly where it wished to land. One of the sellers finally broke under the silence. "Your Excellency," he said, voice strained, "we can resolve this. There is no need to escalate." The sheikh didn't turn. He spoke softly, almost bored. "You inserted a forged addendum into a heritage acquisition. You attempted to transfer liability onto me, and you expected me to thank you for the opportunity." The seller swallowed hard. No words came. One of the experts, the provenance analyst, raised a trembling hand. I wasn't aware of the addendum alteration. I was shown only the scans." The sheikh cut him off with a glance. Not angry, worse, dismissive. Lena watched the tension coil through the room like smoke. She stood near the projector console, small, quiet, wishing she could fold herself into the corner of the carpet. But she knew the direction of the sheikh's attention had shifted permanently. Her invisibility was gone. "It doesn't matter," he said to the expert. "Ignorance is not innocence. You swore authenticity without verifying the source materials." The expert's face turned the color of ash. Then the sheikh faced the sellers. "Finally." His expression remained still, but something lethal had entered his eyes. "You crafted an elegant fraud," he said. "Elegant enough to fool institutions. Elegant enough to fool my advisors. But not elegant enough to fool the one person you dismissed the moment she entered the room." The sellers glanced at Lena, and in that moment, for the first time, they saw her not as a background figure, but as the person who had dismantled their entire operation with a handful of observations and a quiet voice. One of them stepped forward, attempting a final gambit. "She misread the metadata. These anomalies can occur naturally during digital export." "Stop," the sheikh said. The word landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Heavy, final, echoing. He gestured toward Lena. "She has no motive to deceive." "You do." Lena felt her chest tighten. She didn't want to be part of this confrontation. She didn't want the spotlight, the attention, the consequence. But she couldn't look away either. The seller's composure cracked fully now, voices rising in fragmented excuses, denials, accidental admissions that contradicted one another. The experts distanced themselves. The advisors stood stiff as statues, watching the unraveling like witnesses at an execution. The sheikh silenced the room again with a small movement of his hand. Then he fixed his gaze on the men who had engineered the trap. "You attempted to weaponize history," he said, "against me." He let the words settle, then added, "And you failed because you underestimated the quietest person in this room." A faint tremor ran through Lena's spine, because sometimes the greatest confrontation is not a shout or a threat, but a truth spoken without raising a voice. The seller's facade crumbled with unsettling speed. Their suits still looked expensive, their postures still aimed at authority. But everything beneath had begun to rot. The sheikh's advisors circled them at a distance, like cautious observers watching a structure collapse. Lena remained near the console, hands clasped tightly, her breath shallow. She didn't want credit. She didn't want power. She wanted the walls to swallow her whole. But the truth she had exposed had become a living thing now, crawling through every corner of the room. The sheikh strode to the table and lifted the leather folio, the same one he had mocked her with earlier. He opened it calmly, turning the pages one by one, each motion deliberate. "You forged the past," he said, without looking up, and then tried to chain the future to it. One of the sellers protested, desperation leaking into his voice. "You cannot prove we had any intention." The sheikh placed the folio flat on the table with a soft, decisive thud. "Your intention," he said quietly, "is written in the grammar." The sellers exchanged a horrified glance. Grammar, the very thing they believed no billionaire would ever examine. Lena took a small step forward, compelled by a duty she hadn't chosen but could no longer ignore. "The deception wasn't in the artifact itself," she explained gently, though her voice trembled. "It was in the contractual architecture around it. The addendum was the real product you were selling, not the manuscript." The sheikh nodded. "Exactly." One of the experts attempted to salvage his reputation. "Your Excellency, if we rerun the analysis, it's possible the spectral alignment is coincidental." Lena shook her head. "No. The degradation curve is a duplication. That alone invalidates all authenticity claims. And the handwriting overlay uses a modern restoration training stroke. These elements don't happen accidentally. They are deliberate fingerprints." The expert fell silent. The sheikh's lead advisor folded his arms. "So the question becomes, who inserted Addendum B?" All eyes pivoted to the sellers. Their leader inhaled sharply, the kind of breath a man takes before he begins lying professionally. But the sheikh spoke first. "Before you answer," he said, "consider the metadata." He pointed at the lower corner of the projection, the timestamp, the compression artifact, the layered seal. The seller's expressions drained of color. "You were sloppy," the sheikh continued. "Elegant but sloppy." Then he turned, not to the advisors, not to the experts, but to Lena. "You identified the pattern within seconds." She lowered her gaze, the compliment landing like a weight on her shoulders rather than a gift. "I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone," she murmured. "I just recognized the inconsistency." "Eh?" The sheikh's eyes softened by a fraction. "Not warmth, but respect, the rarest currency in rooms like these. You saw because you look where others don't." The sellers finally broke. Fear overtook strategy. One of them blurted, "We had no knowledge." Another hissed, "It was the consultants." A third muttered, "The clause was added for protection." Contradictions piled instantly. The lie had no structure left, and in its place, something far more dangerous emerged. The truth that had been hiding behind every smooth word since the meeting began. Some frauds collapse fast, but the most elaborate ones collapse all at once. The suite felt smaller now, as if the walls had crept inward to witness the unraveling. The sellers stood clustered together, stripped of their earlier confidence, whispering frantic, contradictory explanations that only deepened their guilt. Their suits still gleamed under the recessed lighting, but their faces had dulled into a shared shade of panic. The sheikh remained perfectly still. Stillness, in powerful men, is never calm. It is calculation. Lena sensed it. She stood a few steps away, wanting desperately to retreat into the shadows, but unable to move. She had become part of the geometry of the crisis, whether she liked it or not. Her role, once invisible, was now a hinge on which the room's entire balance turned. The lead seller finally attempted a counterattack. "This "This is a misunderstanding engineered by her," he said, gesturing at Lena with a trembling hand. "She misinterpreted the data. She is not an official examiner. Her assessment cannot invalidate what certified experts confirmed." His desperation carried a rehearsed indignation, like someone performing innocence rather than embodying it. The Sheikh's gaze slid to him with chilling slowness. "She did not invalidate you," the Sheikh said. "You invalidated yourselves." The seller faltered, then pushed further. "She has every reason to exaggerate, to—" "Enough," the Sheikh interrupted. The word was not loud, but it had weight, a finality that crushed all argument. He turned to Lena. "Walk me through the trap," he said, step by step. Her throat tightened. Her fingers dug into the folder she still held. She hadn't spoken more than a few sentences at a time in front of powerful men since the day her academic world collapsed. The memory scraped at her ribs, but she inhaled slowly and stepped closer to the projection. "The forged manuscript wasn't the goal," she began quietly. "It was bait." She pointed to the addendum. "This clause makes you legally responsible for any historical dispute. If authorities discovered the forgery later, it would appear that you tampered with a genuine artifact. The sellers could claim ignorance and walk away clean." One advisor murmured a curse under his breath. Lena continued. "The spectral signatures were duplicated. The ink cracking was patterned. The seals were lifted and recompressed. Every element was designed to create just enough authenticity to survive a superficial review, but fall apart under scrutiny." The Sheikh nodded. "And the purpose?" he asked. Lena hesitated. The answer was heavy. "To make you the perfect scapegoat," she said softly. "Someone wealthy enough to absorb the damage. Someone powerful enough that the scandal would be contained. And someone whose pride, they assumed, would never allow close examination." The sellers blanched. The Sheikh turned toward them slowly. "You believed I would rush to sign," he said. "That I would be blinded by prestige. That I would not listen to a woman you dismissed." Each sentence landed like a blow. The sellers wilted. Lena stepped back, her heart thudding painfully. She expected anger, or triumph, or fury from the Sheikh. But instead, he exhaled softly, as if disappointed rather than enraged. Then, with deliberate calm, he addressed the room. "The truth," he said, "has been spoken." And in the thin, trembling silence that followed, one truth crystallized in Lena's mind. Sometimes, the moment everything breaks apart is the only moment something real begins to form. The sellers were unraveling in real time. Their voices, once smooth and commanding, had devolved into frantic fragments. Excuses that contradicted each other, apologies offered too late, lies collapsing under their own weight. No one in the room believed them anymore, and worse, they no longer believed each other. The Sheikh remained standing at the head of the table, one hand resting lightly on the dossier Lena had saved him from signing. His posture was calm, but the calmness had changed. No longer the stillness of confidence, but the stillness of decision. He had reached his limit. "Sit," he ordered the sellers. They obeyed instantly. He then turned to his advisors. "Record their statements. Every word from this moment forward." Phones emerged. Screens lit up. The sellers stiffened, realizing that every syllable now held consequence. One of the experts began to protest. "Your Excellency, I had no knowledge of the—" The Sheikh cut him off with a slight tilt of his head. "Your ignorance is noted. It will be evaluated accordingly." The expert sat down, shaking. Lena stood at the periphery, clutching her folder, wishing she could dissolve into the carpet. This was the part she feared. The aftermath. Exposure always created fallout, and fallout always dragged down whoever spoke first, even when they spoke the truth. Her chest tightened. What if they turned on her? What if the sheikh blamed her for the chaos? Powerful men sometimes redirected their humiliation toward the nearest woman, but then the sheikh spoke her name, clearly, intentionally. Miss Syelm. Her stomach dropped. Step forward. She did, slowly. Her legs felt numb, as if she walked through cold water. She stopped a few feet from him, unable to lift her gaze. You uncovered a crime, he said. One designed with sophistication, precision, and malice. She swallowed. I only noticed patterns. I didn't mean to. You meant to protect the truth, he interrupted softly. And you did. She looked up, startled. The sheikh continued, now addressing the entire room. A $500 million fraud, executed through forged provenance, manipulated digital scans, and a liability clause engineered to destroy reputations. All exposed because one woman refused to ignore a detail. The sellers bowed their heads, defeated. The sheikh faced them. You attempted to weaponize a woman's silence. A pause. But she wasn't silent. The words hit her harder than she expected. Not praise, not validation, but accuracy. Someone had finally named what she had done. He turned to his advisors. These men will be held accountable. Every document will be reviewed, every payment traced, and every institution that affirmed this forgery will be notified. A wave of dread rippled across the seller's table. The sheikh added, there will be consequences, severe ones. Then he looked back at Lena. You prevented me from stepping into a legal coffin, he said quietly, and you did so despite every reason to stay quiet. She had no answer. Her voice had gone thin with emotion she refused to show. The sheikh nodded once, a gesture of respect rare enough to make her pulse stutter. Sometimes accountability doesn't begin with punishment. It begins with someone finally recognizing who saved them. When the sellers were escorted out of the suite by the sheikh's internal security team, the room finally exhaled. The tension didn't vanish. It thinned, like steam dissolving after a long boil. The advisors straightened their jackets. The experts avoided eye contact, and the city's nightlights pressed faintly against the smoked glass, shimmering like distant witnesses. Only Lena remained completely still. She couldn't understand why she was still there, why the sheikh hadn't dismissed her, why her legs hadn't already carried her out of the suite and into the anonymity she relied on for survival. Then the sheikh approached her, not with the arrogance he'd shown earlier, not with the mocking tone of the man who had tested her translation, but with a measured calm, the calm of someone making a decision he already trusted. Miss Selm, he said, stopping a respectful distance from her. Do you know why I asked you to stay earlier? Her pulse fluttered. No, Your Excellency, because I wanted to see how you observed a room. He paused. And I was right to watch you. She looked down, uncomfortable, under the weight of his gaze. Attention felt dangerous. Praise felt worse. Praise always demanded something later. I did only what I was trained to do, she whispered. No. His voice softened. You did what others were too confident, or too compromised, to do. She had no response. The sheikh gestured for one of his advisors, who quickly brought forth a sealed leather document case. He placed it on the table between them. I oversee a small forensic institute, the sheikh said. Private, precise, focused on linguistic, contractual, and cultural authentication. It is selective to the point of invisibility. Lena's breathing faltered. She took a half step back. He continued. We need someone who sees what others miss. Someone who can detect intention inside language. Someone who can walk into a room full of experts and still notice the detail that saves a fortune. Or prevents a scandal. Her hands went cold. You want me to join you? She asked quietly. I am offering you a position as lead philological analyst, he said. Full authority in your domain. No political games. No academic cruelty. No committees pretending to know more than you. A beat, and a salary that erases your debt. Her chest tightened painfully. He wasn't offering charity. He wasn't offering gratitude. He was offering a place. The very thing she had been denied for years. But doubt crept in anyway. I'm not... She swallowed. I'm not good at being seen. A faint smile touched his expression. Then you will be perfect. My best analysts are invisible. Their work is what speaks. She closed her eyes for a moment. Not to think. She already knew the truth. But to steady the surge of emotion rising behind her ribs. When she reopened them, she met his gaze. I accept. His nod carried the weight of something irreversible. Sometimes the door that changes everything isn't grand or loud. Sometimes it opens quietly, the moment someone realizes you were never invisible at all. The new institute wasn't large. No marble halls, no ceremonial wings. Just a quiet, meticulously organized floor inside a discreet research building overlooking the water. It suited her. It felt like a place built for precision rather than spectacle. Lena walked its corridors now with a different posture, calm, measured, grounded. She wore her badge on the outside of her coat. A small, simple change, but one that still surprised her every morning. Her office was filled with things she never expected to own. Stabilized vellum samples, multi-spectrum readers, rare manuscript scans, and a desk that wasn't borrowed or shared. A life that wasn't borrowed or shared. The sheikh visited occasionally, never intrusively, always with the same quiet respect he'd shown her in the suite that night. He called her the reason the Institute has a future, a phrase she still didn't know how to accept. But the truth lived in her daily routines. Her debt was gone. Her work mattered, and she no longer needed invisibility to survive. Sometimes she paused at the window, watching the ripple of city lights across the water, remembering the moment everything shifted. Not when she spoke, but when she chose to. Because every life can turn on a single detail, seen clearly by someone who refuses to look away. If this story gripped you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the next narrative.